Welcome to the Matsunaga Institute for Peace and the William S. Richardson School of Law as we celebrate International Day of Peace and Constitution Day with a panel discussion on climate justice and positive peace building. My name is Dasha Figueroa from the Matsunaga Institute at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Today's event will be live streamed by the support of our community Facebook pages through the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament and Common Security, Seeds of Peace, Conflict Resolution Alliance, East-West Center Leadership Program, Institute for Climate and Peace, KTUH Honolulu, and the Spark-M Matsunaga Institute for Peace and Conflict Resolution. Thank you for joining us today. Our event today is on climate justice, opportunity, courage, action. It is important that we braid the tools of climate justice and positive peace building to address climate crises that are triggering violence and injustice. Climate change exacerbates the harm of ethnic or racial exclusions and inequality. Flooding, water scarcity, and community health disparities increase the suffering of undersupported communities. Climate justice can offer impetus for compassion and collaborative problem solving and recovery. We have an amazing group of people joining us for today's dialogue. Our moderator is Dr. Maya Soetoro, who is a faculty at the Matsunaga Institute and serves as a consultant to the Obama Foundation, working closely with their international team to develop programming in the Pacific Asia region. Dr. Soetoro sits on many voluntary boards and is the co-founder of the nonprofit Seeds of Peace, Institute for Climate and Peace, and the Peace Studio. Our panelists today consist of Dr. Camille Nelson, who is a professor and dean of the William S. Richardson School of Law. Dean Nelson has long been an outstanding member of the legal community. Her scholarship focuses on the intersection of critical race theory and culture studies, with particular emphasis on health law, criminal law and procedure, and comparative law. Also joining us is Dr. Maxine Burkett, who is a professor of the William S. Richardson School of Law and a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Dr. Burkett is an international expert on the law and policy of climate change. She has presented her work in a diverse area of climate law throughout the United States and in West Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Caribbean. Additionally, joining us is Dr. Kealoha Fox, who is the Native Hawaiian Liaison and Public Policy Manager at Aloha Care, a nonprofit safety net health plan in Hawaii. Dr. Fox is a Kanaka Maoli Native Hawaiian scientist, practitioner, and advocate. Her work weaves the relationships between individuals, family, community, environment, and spiritual realm with the rights of Indigenous people to participate in the design, good governance, and implementation of social improvement services. Our final panelist joining us is Dr. Victoria Keener, who is a research fellow at the East-West Center in Honolulu, Hawaii, and the lead principal investigator of the Pacific Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessments Program. Dr. Keener also does research on enabling practical applications of climate science for regional decision-making. Much of her modeling work uses multivariate time series analysis and varied spectral methods to identify dominant climate trends in hydrological variables and how they change through time. To get us started, I will turn it over to our moderator, Auntie Maya.
Thank you, Dasha. I'm so grateful to be your Auntie Maya. I think that your presence is the embodiment of the inclusive intergenerational climate activism that is so important to all of us. Really grateful for the presence of all in attendance here today, both panelists and participants and attendees. The adverse effects of climate change are obviously being felt everywhere and eventually will touch everyone. But the most vulnerable people living in the world's poorest countries and and the world's 2.5 billion smallholder farms and fisheries, people who depend on climate and natural resources for food and income are being disproportionately impacted. Many of the communities where low-income families, people of color live, play, work, are experiencing the most devastating effects of exposure, vulnerability, and attitudes. The attitude that there are expendable sacrifice zones is impacting the resilience of these communities. Given these disproportionate impacts and all that we are suffering and experiencing today, I am grateful for this conversation and for the work of those on the panel and many of you who are attending. I'd like to first ask the panelists to briefly introduce yourselves and your work and share some of your experiences and perspectives around climate injustice, if you would. Perhaps we can begin with Dean Nelson and then proceed with Dr. Fox and Dr. Burkett and Dr. Keener.
Thank you very much for that very kind welcome. And thank you, Dasha, as well. I want to humbly acknowledge that I am not a doctor. I don't want to be seen as perpetrating. These sisters on the panel are the real experts. And so I'm here to learn as much as anybody else. But I'm delighted to be here and thank you for including me. I'm blessed to be the dean at the William S. Richardson School of Law. I started in the summer. Before that, I was dean in American University, Washington College of Law, and before that at Suffolk University in Boston. I see my engagement with this as trying to support those of you who are expert and the lawyers of the future, and therefore the leaders of the future as well. So much of what I think I'm called to do, at least for this time, as much as I am able, is to hear you and to learn from you, to celebrate, uplift you, to make sure your voices carry and are heard as they are crucial. When I think about, from my limited place of knowledge, is experiential in terms of my thought that we should all be able to breathe freely. And I'll say bluntly, as an asthmatic, I'm preoccupied with breath, be that breath being taken away from environmental degradation, from socio-determinants of ill health that are underwritten by various isms, and breath being taken away through police brutality. And so I think about climate justice as bringing all of these together during a pandemic when we have to ask ourselves, how do we take care of each other and those who are most vulnerable in our communities, and ask ourselves, why do we have disparate vulnerability across various communities? And what does that have to do with the environment, for example? And so I very much look forward to our conversation because I think it's crucial to bring all of these intersecting threads together and to hear from the affected as well, so we can figure out how to move forward.
Mahalo, Dean Nelson. Velina mai me ke aloha kako, aloha me ka ha'aha'a, me ka oia i'o, a me ka viva ole. My name is Kealoha Fox, and I am a grateful daughter, a proud mother, and an aloha aina. I come to this work from the healthcare sector, especially working every day to serve those who have been economically oppressed. So my work is largely in the Medicaid and Medicare space, which is not without many debates on every front page newspaper or any evening news show you might be watching. But more deeply than the professional hat that I wear, mine is really a homegrown genealogy of my responsibility towards racial justice and my responsibility in Kuleana to this aina, the aina of my kupuna. In the homeland of my ancestors as a Native Hawaiian woman. And I've really grown up to learn that for us as Indigenous, Native, First Nation, and Aboriginal peoples, climate action is something each of us can do. The healing work is something that we can do for ourselves, in our families, in our communities, and the work that we need to do to heal our environments. Yet climate justice work is the work that's yet to be done by the major institutions and contributors of corporate injustice and the ways in which they have largely contributed to the state that we're in now in 2020, and that those of us like Dr. Keener and I who are trained as scientists, as women who know, we have data, we have facts to support this. I also come as a formal civil servant, and I really define climate justice through systemic changes that I believe should be equitable, they should be inclusive, and that we should be defining climate justice really as meaning that health and well-being should be a part of all policies, and that self-determination should be a right for all Indigenous peoples as stewards of their lands, of their ainas, and their places that they call home. I agree completely with Dean Nelson. I too am a believer in right now the experience of the social determinants of death, and that is something that I hope that we can start to uncover and unlayer today in our conversation. Mahalo for having me.
Thanks, everyone. It's great to be here and be a part of this conversation. I should also say that I'm not a doctor. I am a professor of law. I am science adjacent most of my life because I've been, I'm from a family of scientists, which is what makes me think that I have been sort of called to do this weaving together of both law, justice, and our natural environment. My background from sort of day one in the field has been work on environmental justice and climate justice and seeing the intersections of those fields and those spaces. I do research that involves migration. I'm looking almost exclusively at those that are underrepresented, underserved, or have less negotiating power in the spaces where that's most relevant to be sorted out, especially for small islands. I do work on peace and conflict and have the privilege of serving as the co-founder of the Institute for Climate and Peace alongside Dr. Soetoro. My engagement with the field has been about understanding disproportionate impacts on communities of color, on Black people, on Indigenous peoples, but also understanding that the causes of those disproportionate impacts are deeply interrelated. And Dr. Soetoro made mention of sacrifice zones, and there have been for a long time environmental sacrifice zones that have proved up the sort of the fundamental, I think, truth about this reality. Climate change and the racial hierarchy, for example, are deeply interrelated in cause and consequence. Even our cabined understanding of what the environment is and our natural environment and our ability to feel that we're expert in speaking about the health and well-being within that environment is a product of these relationships and these hierarchies, right? We understand environmentalism as something that is a privilege. It's a privilege of wealth and the North, the global North, of oftentimes white male and large institutions. But in fact, environmental justice from day one sort of affirmed this notion that what our environments are where we live, work, and play. And that encompasses, I think, the holism of other ways of understanding the environment and understanding that we ourselves are a reflection of that, right? We're not nature, we're not defending nature, we are nature defending itself. The other truism is that the carbon economy requires sacrifice zones and disposable people. And in order to justify those sacrifice zones and disposable people, or treating people as though they're disposable, you need the isms that Dean Nelson was describing, right? Because then you just justify the treatment of those people as less than. I can provide a few more examples of that, but I just wanted to offer that as some of the backdrop understanding. And when we're talking about climate justice, it's really about understanding both how these phenomena intersect. And in fact, in order to have gotten to where we are right now, these experiences of subjugation were critically a part of that, our present tense. So I'll stop there and thank you again for the opportunity to join the conversation.
Good afternoon. I'm very happy to be here on this panel today with this group of formidable women, and thank you again for the invitation. I'm Victoria Keener, and I am a research fellow at the East-West Center, which is a research institute on the campus of the University of Hawaii, but not actually part of the University of Hawaii, which I know a lot of people find confusing. So at the East-West Center, I run a program called the Pacific RISA program, which is an interdisciplinary climate research program that really tries to bring together both social and physical scientists with stakeholders on the ground to design projects that really bring climate science out of just the pure science realm and apply it to decision-making, natural resource management, and policy. So Maxine has actually been part of the Pacific RISA for years now and has been a wonderful partner, but you know, we really encompass everyone from physical scientists to decision scientists and psychologists, economists, legal scholars. So it's quite an interesting group. So in terms of my what I bring to the field of climate justice and injustice, you know, it is that physical science perspective again. But one of the first ways I really saw it manifested and thought about it in terms of my work and how I relate to it was a couple of years ago. I was the lead author of the Hawaii and Pacific Islands chapter of the 4th U.S. National Climate Assessment, which is a federal report that's done every 4 years that is supposed to assess and synthesize kind of key climate knowledge and impacts. And so I was leading the Pacific Islands region. And one of our sections almost casually mentioned the issue of climate justice as being very critical for Pacific Islanders. And as that went through all of the series of reviews, that term was one that was flagged by federal agencies as needing to be removed because of the legal liability aspect that the term climate justice implied. So that started a couple months of me going back and forth with different federal agencies trying to figure out what would work in its place since they couldn't accept it. And a long negotiation ended up with them accepting the issues of sovereignty, human and national security, and equity. So that's what I ended up getting in there. But it really started making me think, you know, why is this such a powerful term that it's being censored by the federal government and not being allowed to occur in these reports? So also as an interdisciplinary scientist working in hydrology and climate, that also works in that policy translation realm, I've seen how certain groups are marginalized, whether it's from you know, being remote from centers of political power. So that could be from you know, Hawaii's position being very distant from Washington, D.C., or it could be in the region, you know, the Federated States of Micronesia being distant from Hawaii. Also economic influence, or systemic injustices that continue to be felt across the region, such as colonialism and the legacy of nuclear testing. So we see it today in terms of solar farms, placements around the islands in certain communities, even the times that meetings are held that people can't make it to because they have to work regular hours or can't, you know, participate in government and climate planning. FEMA funds, for example, aren't accessible to freely associated Pacific Island states. And really, you know, this culminates in how the ideas of economic recovery and climate adaptation and mitigation are segregated today, when really, you know, to truly get that climate justice synthesis, they need to be considered together. So I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. That's already such a rich array of observations that you have shared with us. I'm really grateful for your diverse vantage points and the multifacetedness of your endeavors. It's so important that we be multidirectional and intersectional at this time. I want to talk briefly here about the words of Nicole Hannah Jones, who in a recent New York Times magazine article said, "It feels different this time." Now, Nicole Hannah Jones is a 1619 project curator, and I want to ask you in attendance on the panel, how did we get to this moment in particular? And from your vantage points, does it in fact look or feel different to you this time? However you interpret those words. And anyone who wishes to answer that, please step in.
I'll offer a few thoughts if that's okay. And just, I know this will tee up a lot of conversation. And so I'll just briefly say, I think these conversations repeat with such frequency as to be exhausting and fatiguing and numbing. And I think one of the things that is helpful in preventing this pervasive sense of despair that I think many of us are grappling with is the diversity of outrage that at least seems to be more visible on the streets, if not in the conversations that are taking place around the country and also around the world. So I don't want to forget, you know, these conversations, you know, when Barbados is saying we're not anymore going to have the Queen as our, you know, head of state, you know, as a Jamaican, you know, that is a direct, and it was explicit, shrugging off of colonial and imperial overlay. So I just want to put that out there, because what I hope at least comes out of this is the enhanced forging of allyship and coalitions that are impactful and transformative and durable.
I can chime in as well, and just, you know, sort of absolutely affirming everything that Nelson has shared, and also just sort of suggesting from my vantage point that, you know, we are seeing a more nuanced discussion in terms of how we diagnose the problem. Right, it has been pretty reductionist, as in there's sort of one bad apple, or this is very context specific. But we're recognizing the sort of the structural nature of some of these ills that we've been grappling with for a very, very long time. So never before have I seen as much articulation of sort of structural racism in the analysis, the debrief around what we've been experiencing and witnessing. And that, I think, is a really critical element of this, because there has been something that has been structural, systemic, and deeply rooted that we have not been really addressing, right? And so the analogy that I've been using to sort of put my own head around it has been one of a tree, right? We've always looked for the low-hanging fruit, but we really need to get to the roots, right? And root to branch. And so getting to the roots means that we start using language like structural racism to see that there is actually a structure that is operating here with, you know, a certain ingrained set of rules. And it's manifesting in different ways throughout our communities and throughout the world. I see that as actually also in the climate space, which is to say that there is a notion that there's something rotten in the structure. And there were even conversations and young folks that are out in the street are demanding reparations, climate reparations, right? These are terms that I haven't seen in my, what feels like very long relationship with climate change, climate justice, climate activism, that seems to just sort of fall off the tongue of younger folks. They have a more nuanced understanding of the interrelationship, and they're not as frightened by naming it as such. And if you do that, if you recognize that, then you understand that the solutions are also much more interwoven and complex in sort of an intentional and perhaps beautiful way, if we're able to use interventions that get us to a better future, which I think we can. I will also just sort of offer that when we're looking at this as well, the moment right now suggests that we can't be siloed in our thinking about climate change, even more so. And what I love about this panel is that it is profoundly interdisciplinary, and it is meeting the proper definition of the environment as I see it. It is not one that is about compartmentalizing our struggles. It is not leaving the definition of the environment and who we care about within those to sort of the niche corners. And it's seeing, again, that interrelationship, particularly with public health. And I'll just tell a very quick story, which is that there was a recent reporting in New York Times that had a private taping of a corporate fossil fuel meeting, and the conversation was about the flaring that was happening with respect to natural gas, and in fact that there was more flaring. They were lying about the reporting that they were doing, and they were saying, you know, we're actually playing whack-a-mole. First the environmentalists were talking about the environment, now they're talking about the public health. You know, we got to just knock it all down. It's almost, I found it really interesting. I was like, oh, well, they understand what environment means. You know, like they understand that these things are part of it, and that's the front line they see themselves fighting. And so if we can connect in that way, what makes this moment different is that we understand that structures exist, that they are in constant conversation with one another, either quietly or very overtly, and that our solutions need to match that.
I'll jump in and share because I feel like this weekend I was reminded that my 7-year-old and his cousin, who's also 7, were discussing whack-a-moles in the backseat of my car this weekend. And I find it just as fascinating that they're using those same terms in the same ways that we're hearing on all of these webinars and these panels and these virtual conferences and convenings that we're a part of. And there's a part of it for me that feels like it's definitely a pivotal moment. It feels like an earthquake. I will say in the health and medicine space, we're starting to see much more contributions in that intersectionality than I think we've seen in years in the past. And so I think we're finally starting to see locally leaders like Dr. Kate Cooney Blaisdell, who's a pioneer of the Johnny Burns School of Medicine, where I graduated from. You know, his ideology and his principles from the 80s and the 90s are now on constant top of mind. And I think it's those cracks that have shown in the isms and the ways in which we're trying to whack all of the whack-a-moles that we've long known that are now a part of every conversation. And that portion of it makes it feel like we're not the only person in the room, right? That where you had that feeling before. I remember being a part of many professional associations and being a part of many conferences and spaces where this just wasn't, climate justice, racial injustice was not a part of a discussion you would have in public health and medicine. And now it's part of everything, right? And so I think about that, and I think about the ways in which we're defining, and like Maxine said, the ways in which we're diagnosing disparities has really opened up. And I love that Maxine has also uplifted the role of the youth. I think many of us can agree that we were trained with this incremental academic philosophy. If I was trained, I'll just speak from my own history and share my own mo'olelo. I was trained just to be a note taker on the fringes of the room. And then finally get to a point where maybe I would be invited to be a designee from the actual leader at that table and at that conversation. And then finally being able to be the person that was invited because of my intellect, because of my EK, because the ways in which I've contributed to that space were finally acknowledged and welcomed. And I will never forget what it felt like to be asked when I was a part of the very first convening as a commissioner to the Hawaii State Climate Mitigation and Adaptation Commission, and somebody asked me whose assistant was I, and if I was there to take notes as their assistant. And I think that's so much of what we're talking about and why it's so exhausting, but also why the critical conversations that are intersectional and transdisciplinary, like the ones we're having today, are incredibly important, because I know, especially because of the co-partners to convene today's event, we have a lot of faculty here, we have a lot of students here, and we have a lot of lifelong learners where the book isn't written of where do we go from here. And I think we're writing it actively together. And that I hope that any young woman of color doesn't have to experience that same trajectory to get to their place at the table. And I actually hope that we dismantle those manufactured tables altogether, and that we weave the mats that our ancestors are asking and pleading for us to sit upon.
And compelling. I appreciate all of you for giving us that view, given the refrain in politics sometimes, and with climate deniers still at play. I'm glad to know that this is a more nuanced time of articulation and a more inclusive time of participation. I want to just speak to that a little bit more, perhaps. I have been thinking about the fact that elders carry stories and wisdom and lived experience, culture and history, and so much knowledge about how to deal with a changing climate and how to source community solutions. And everyone here, as you point out, is a mentor, teacher, and you all know the value of intergenerational relationships. And I have been so moved by young people who are scared and frustrated, annoyed, legitimately angry, but also brave and optimistic. Young people and artists like Shutekskat Martinez, people like in Ghana, the Pomei, the Ghana Youth Environmental Movement, and Nisrit Al-Saim of the Sudan Youth Organization for Climate Change. These folks were recently highlighted in Yes Magazine and other places. And I know that the latest State of the Civil Society report from Global Civil Society Alliance has put the spotlight on this rising generation of young climate leaders who are giving fresh energy and impetus. And because we're speaking from an educational institution, I must ask how we best foster sort of intergenerational duets wherein we are encouraging, supporting, learning from, and empowering young people to work for climate justice in their communities, and how we can really truly collaborate between generations. What does climate justice education look like? But also, what does that intergenerational movement building and duet sound like? Anyone? I mean, I love that you're talking about getting rid of the tables altogether. So where are we sitting then, if not at those tables?
Kealoha, I don't know if you want to jump in, but I can just sort of start with a few thoughts. It's maybe departing a little bit from the table metaphor, but context setting a little bit more. But first, you know, Maya, you reminded me when you were talking about climate denial. I had just I was revisiting some notes, and when Bill McKibben was here, the great climate activist Bill McKibben, when he was asked how he responds to climate deniers, he says, well, you may not believe in climate change, but climate change believes in you, which I thought was such a perfect way to describe it, right? So here's my thinking, right? If we actually were to do an assessment of the world that we've grown up in, and for us who are at the cusp of eldership, you know, if we look back on what we've gotten used to, it's actually pretty dystopian. And let me say that, you know, we've gotten used to the carbon economy, we've gotten used to fossil fuels being what runs the world, but from extraction through to combustion, it's a sort of miserable product, right? We've gotten used to regular oil spills, again, disproportionately impacting communities in Niger Delta, which has had years-long spills, you know, phenomena such as Cancer Alley in parts of Louisiana, and of course, stresses in places like Port Arthur, Texas, amplified by storms, air pollution and poor quality, COVID vulnerabilities that have sort of highlighted the fact that we have long-term exposures to other environmental toxins that are, again, a part and parcel to the carbon economy, mercury in our air and water and our food, our fish, and then, of course, the incidences of cancer, asthma, cardiovascular disease. All of these things that we take as a given are a byproduct of this world that we live in right now, the economy that it sits upon. And I think that, and that actually says nothing about the acute sort of conflicts that we see, the young people that we have sent off to wars to extract more of this material. And so I just want to sort of suggest that what we have to offer first is the perspective of living in a state of disharmony that many of us didn't even realize until the sort of curtain was pulled back during this COVID period. Right? And we have done that. We've seen, for some people had seen the Himalayas clearly for the first time, had seen a blue sky, had a view of the Taj Mahal through pictures in some cases because you couldn't go there as a result of COVID. And what is really wonderful and important to remember is that we're seeing that the world can look different, We know we have the technology and all of that. We can talk about the specifics, but we could imagine a transition that need not look as lonely and as austere as this period of lockdown is as a result of the coronavirus, but gives us a glimpse of what we might be able to have as far as our futures are concerned. What does it look like to have a negative carbon economy? The promise of that has all of these other ancillary benefits. And if we can present our, what we have lived through for the last several decades as an opportunity to not replicate that, not define prosperity by that, but actually have it be something and look like something much different, where we can literally breathe more freely in all sorts of ways, then I think we're at the start of a really rich and robust conversation. To paraphrase a few great thinkers that are saying that we need to make just and liberated futures irresistible, I think we can in conversation, and that's what that sort of intergenerational conversation should look like. Not accepting the status quo as anything other than an eddy in the sort of longer journey of our human community.
And I just want to layer on that, Professor Burkett, Maxine, I thought that was beautiful and well said. And I want to amplify the young people, the potential for the young people, especially as, some of us are educators, and certainly I think we're all tasked with, encouraging the next generations. In terms of the millennials and the Gen Zers, I want to lift up the fact that they are the most diverse generations. They are the most educated generations. They are the most multilingual, multiracial, most well-traveled. They are the most progressive in lots of ways, if we talk specifically about ideology. And, I was invited a couple of years ago to speak at a law day event in New York City about sort of like the phrasing was sort of the challenge of these coming generations. And I turned it around because I think there's incredible promise, because they also recognize, frankly, this is urgent. I mean, this is my lifetime, and I'm a lot older, but their lifetime for sure. And so they're envisioning what their world is going to look like. And they're making decisions and choices based upon a very hard reality of what we have left them as an inheritance. So I think the fact that they are not stakeholders in the same sort of economies of which Professor Burkett spoke, rather they're thinking about how they can transform those systems to have a more sustainable future for themselves and their potential family members. And so, I just want to encourage us with humility in terms of, my generation, the generation before me, to think about how we can learn from, accept, and to your metaphor, Dr. Fox, make sure this generation is in conversation with us, and, that we are not just like saying, oh, now you can come, we acknowledge you, we recognize you, and like we're bestowing some incredible gift, but we recognize that they have to be, and we need to listen to the partnership and collaborative possibilities of these generations to come, because I think we have a lot to learn. Not just because they're so much more nimble with technology, which is huge, but also because, for them, this is what we have put before them as the problem of their, like the existential crisis of their generations, right? So I think we have to be willing to more than just sort of say, we'll let you come and talk to us here and there, right? They have to be centered, I think, in these conversations. And I think that's some of what we're seeing around the country, the push for us to listen, and for the establishment, in quote, to listen and be much more conversational and frankly more respectful and appreciative of what is being offered up as wisdom and knowledge of future generations and these generations as well. We don't have all the answers, clearly.
I have a short comment just on the, I agree with everything that all the wonderful speakers have been saying. Thanks, Dean Melson and Maxine. I was just thinking about going back to kind of from the higher education vantage point of climate justice, and back to the importance of emphasizing collaborations that are truly interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary, that really bring different types of people together, both at the undergraduate and graduate level. Everyone has mentioned how they've been, everyone is, especially in, graduate work, you're very narrow, you become very narrow in an expertise, and you funnel all of your attention into one very small thing to get that degree, that PhD or whatever. But then when it comes back to it, if you really want to make a difference in terms of resource management or policy or climate justice, you have to be able to work across a wide group of people and bring in different vantage points. And from a higher education perspective, interdisciplinary work and scholarship is not rewarded as much as is, that very narrow specialization. You can see it in like journal articles. Interdisciplinary journals have a lower impact factor, which is how you measure how well cited the articles are. And just work is not encouraged that really where you are going outside of your narrow silo. So I think that's something at the higher educational level that really needs to change. And we need to be able to better integrate that social and physical science as well as other expertise, things like historical analysis. Bringing that in is just as important for bringing a complete picture of climate justice and climate change. So for example, in physical science and in the data collection of these climate variables and analysis that we work in, it's so important to be able to link these changes in the climate variables to socioeconomic variables on the ground and how that really impacts communities. Because if you reduce or eliminate a certain ecosystem or population or sector of data from that conversation, it really doesn't exist if you don't have that data when policy or adaptations are made. So we already see that in Hawaii and the Pacific Islands, which have had significant decreases in monitoring stations for climate and weather variables over the last couple of decades. And we don't get climate model projections that are available for all of the contiguous United States and provided by federal research funds. So really, if we lose our eyes on what's happening on the ground and aren't able to link these physical climate impacts with social and economic indicators, we lose that ability to learn from it and prepare for the future. So I really wanted to make that plug for interdisciplinary education.
Can I quickly piggyback on that, just because amen, right? And as someone who's often been like, well, I've been in rooms, not as much lately, where they're like, well, what do lawyers have to do with climate change, right? Actually from other lawyers as well. And this is a phenomenon of compartmentalization that we're starting to talk about more, I think, in the legal environmental literature, which is to say that we handle some of these issues as science or environment issues and don't realize that so many of the levers for actually making those things better exist in the trade and the econ space, for example. And so if most of the decisions are being made there in the realm of commerce, but have such profound impact on the environment, we are, from the perspective of the law, essentially impotent to actually have any impact on it from the environmental perspective. So thinking about it in a couple ways, and actually maybe putting my dean on the spot a little bit, I've always thought that climate change should at least be mandatory. All of my students are always like, how does everyone else not know what's going to happen? Or even better, it is properly infused into the rest of the curriculum, right? And if you think about just one but major professional school, we are not preparing our students to actually know what's coming for them. And one of the conversations I had with another environmental law professor was, we need to be integrating that. And he was like, well, I can't imagine my bankruptcy colleague wanting to teach about this. And I was like, well, I bet you the bankruptcy attorneys at PG&E, with the wildfires in California, wish they'd known about some of the risks that we're facing, right? It's impossible for us to be engaging continually, whether through education or, as you're talking about, Dr. Keener, in the production of science and useful science, without thinking about these things in close harmony and being really intentional about that, because they're wide gaps and there are clearly spaces of more privileged decision-making that's happening.
Excellent point. As you often say, Maxine, climate is the context by which all the rest of life takes place. And so we do need to weave this information, this understanding, and these commitments into every discipline. I so appreciate you offering us that reminder. Given the interdisciplinary nature of all of this, I do want to ask folks here, and we see now, of course, that COVID is not unrelated to climate, for instance. What was simply an environmental issue now too often is also a public health issue, and everything is understood as being braided, or understood by some. So can you just speak briefly to how COVID might have impacted your perspectives, as well as your perspectives on climate change, but also your process in terms of climate justice work?
I can start with that one. I know everyone has some great answers, so I'll try and keep it brief. So for me during this time, it's been very trying, personally and professionally, but it's become painfully obvious over this year and the shutdowns that only systemic changes in our energy systems, our governance systems, health systems, transportation, economic policies, all of the above are going to have a chance at containing the impacts from climate change. And as all of these reports come out about, BP, for example, having popularized the personal carbon footprint and changing the conversation to individual instead of systemic change, we have to shift this conversation away from what these major greenhouse gas emitters want us to concentrate on, which is that personal contribution, and towards a political atmosphere that puts equality, justice, environmental and personal health above economic profits and economic growth. And I think that's what's become most clear during the shutdowns and the pandemic.
I'll just say, having relocated from the DMV, the DC area, especially as things started to become more clear in the late spring, the interconnections between heightened vulnerability, risk factors, and the like that would predispose one to death do not live inherently in our bodies, right? It is not that, Indigenous people, Black people, Latinx people are like inherently, unhealthy or, besieged by dis-ease and disease, such as to, render them more vulnerable. I think what has been surfaced, and again, going to this more nuanced conversation that has arisen during, frankly, these ongoing crises, is that one has to beg the societal system-wide question, right? Why is that we see these disparate numbers of in terms of death, right? I mean, I think I was reading this week that Black people in this country are 2 times more likely, right, to die. And I mean, it harkens back to a quote that I probably overuse, but I think it's brilliant, which is Professor Ruth Gilmore's quote that, part of the definition of racism is that premature exposure to death, right? It is the extra legal production and exploitation of group differentiated exposure to premature death. And I think the pandemic has forced us in many ways to confront that reality and not have the rationale for that live, harking back to, centuries of yesterday, in someone's body because they are inherently inferior. But to ask us to really unpack the societal disparities that create the vulnerability in the first place.
Can I just say amen again on on that, right? I mean, these are the sacrificed bodies, people and planet, people and bodies of water, people of color. It's absolutely true. The data bear it out, and I think that a couple of things. One is that to go back to what Dr. Keener was saying about the focus on the individual versus the structural, which is, again, what we see the data prove up in terms of our life expectancies and the toxic burdens that BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color experience. These are seen to be, or tried to be framed as individual issues, but are structural at base. And to go back to the sort of part 2 of what I mentioned about the clearer air that happened as a result of COVID, right, and the lockdowns, that was just a fraction of the greenhouse gas emissions that are emitted. So we all shut down. We've all been, either happily for a moment and then miserably locked into our very small spaces. And we still haven't even really scratched the surface of what we need to do to get our greenhouse gas emissions down. That's because so much of that is based on, again, the sort of the immovable, intractable elements of our carbon economy that are very much determined by larger companies and the decisions that they're making. So I think recognizing, again, that this is something that we have to battle at a systemic level and a broader level is an important thing. And I'm sure we'll have time at some point to say that this is doable later on, right? But one of the other sort of bits of food for thought that I'd like to offer is with my ICP hat on, with the climate and peace hat on, which is to say that what we're learning about COVID and what I've found as a good learning opportunity in terms of thinking about climate change is that there is something about what we're doing with positive peace building that seems to be important. And Maya, I would hop in at any point here because this is your expertise, but what we know is that positive peace building as opposed to negative peace, which is the actual sort of absence of conflict. Positive peace building is about the institutions and the attitudes and the ways of life in the community that are actually going to allow us to sustain levels of peace, right, and to resolve conflict and transform as a result of it. And so what we've seen is that at the individual, at the state, and the national level, elements of that, of equity, equitable distribution of resources, fair governments, fair, free-flowing access to information. These things have set up circumstances that have allowed some communities to thrive relative to others. And social cohesion is a big part of it. At the state level, for example, there's really great reporting on how Vermont has been more successful in responding to COVID. And a lot of that has to do with social trust and the relationships and the social contracts that they have between each other. At the national level, notwithstanding some of the setbacks recently, New Zealand, Aotearoa, has been seen as a sort of pinnacle of leadership, even with the shocks and the reemergence of them. They have the strongest indicators of positive peace in their community, and they've had an enviable response to both COVID and to climate change. So we actually have some great blueprints for how this can be done well. And I'll just sort of add, too, that the countries with women leaders have also fared better.
Oh, I would love to step in here. First say, well put, Maxine. And as a peace builder, I'm proud of my climate science partner.
I'm learning.
You're fantastic. Better than learning. You're teaching us all. I am wanting at this point, though, to jump in based on what Maxine just said and ask a question to Camille, because you are the newly inaugurated leader of the law school. I want to point out that all of the fabulous panelists for today's event are women. They're all women, you're all women leaders, and we also know that women are being disproportionately impacted by climate change. But as Maxine pointed out, there are a lot of women leaders who seem to be doing better than other leaders with regard to leadership for climate change, mitigation, adaptation, to address COVID. And women leaders are doing well in many ways right now. So I wanted to ask you to speak about women's leadership, if you would, and perhaps give advice to those who are coming up at this time as women leaders. You know, what are the pitfalls and the possibilities for women who work on issues that, like climate justice, are rooted and systemically reproduce and require that transformative thinking and action?
Sure. So I think change is hard. And I remember when I first started deaning about 10 years ago, thinking, why is this so hard to get to the work? I have to cut through all this other static, right? Why do I have to do all of this other navigating of my identity? And I will add to that, it's race and gender, but at the time, as a person who was at least perceived as young, you know, there's age as well, because people expect leaders in certain spaces. And I will say, especially in the law, no doubt in medicine, no doubt in engineering, no doubt in so many of these disciplines, right? Where people expect sort of a gray-haired senior gentleman to walk into the room. That creates a context that frankly creates more work for us. One, we have to disabuse people of their presumptions of incompetence, right? And there are two great anthologies around women of color in the legal academy called Presumed Incompetent, and that is real. There's a heightened scrutiny that is often brought to bear, and there is, frankly, some other work as we try to put people at ease with us, right? Which is part of the work that allows us then to do the real work, which is the work of leadership that everybody else gets to do, often by virtue of presumptions of competence, presumptions of excellent pedigree, presumptions of expertise, presumptions of competence versus incompetence. So I want to acknowledge that, but I also want to encourage especially young women and people who are from quote unquote non-traditional backgrounds in any leadership space to understand that when we opt out of these possibilities, and I was one of them too. I had all of the reasons why, of course, I would never be a dean. Why did, don't you see me? Like, and let me break down all the parts of me that are going to prevent me ever, perhaps being in these roles. Like I had the sort of mental illogic that would sort of confine me to, certain relegated spaces as well. But when we opt out in those ways, we're basically absenting ourselves from real decision-making and the exercise of discretion, meaning power. And so I always encourage women to ask, where are we absent, right? Where, and people of color and non-traditional candidates in whatever discipline, where when you look in the space, virtual, physical, whatever the conceptual space might be, is there no one like us? That's where you need to be. I'm just sorry. And we need to stop sort of like handing over by virtue of the forces that confine us, and some of that is our own mental enforcement of the societal confinement. We need to stop conceding power, because those voices, your voices, the next generation of leaders' voices, and all its beauty and all its diversity is absolutely what we need right now. So whether that is, and I keep saying, whether that's tax, whether that's real estate, whether that's bankruptcy, whether that's all the intersections of corporate security with business associations, with con law, with whatever, we need to be there. So I just encourage us to keep thinking about the ways in which we need to be in places where perhaps heretofore we have not had the chance to speak and be heard.
Woo, preaching. I appreciate the passion, fervor, and intelligence with which you make that call. We are at 4 o'clock, and I wanted to share with everyone the fact that in about half an hour, we will take some audience questions. So if any participants have questions, by all means, send them in. I also want to remind you to please share with us your water, your earth. Let us know where you are coming from. We are interested, even if we can't address you directly. It helps us to feel in community at this moment, to know where you are, and to feel your presence, and to connect from a distance. Thank you so much. It's been a beautiful hour, and I'd like to continue perhaps with a question for Victoria. Victoria, you work in spaces of intercultural and international exchange, and many of the people who are joining us today come from elsewhere or are connected to elsewhere. I wanted to ask you about your perception on the gaps in the research or understanding when it comes to sort of cross-cultural climate justice or action, or how do you think we can better connect regions and countries and spaces for collaborative solution finding, and of course data driven solutions and sharing?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And so just as a bit of background, my research and my research group, we all work in both Hawaii and the US affiliated Pacific Islands, but we do international research in the Pacific Islands as well, but really with that concentration on US affiliated states. Pacific Island communities have been extremely active in advocating at global scales for climate justice. So this has been for a much longer time than maybe we've been aware of in the national media. This could be through international activism, such as the former president of Kiribati, Anote Tong, was a noted advocate for climate justice. It could be through regional negotiations and instruments such as the Madro Declaration, the Bow Declaration, or the Blue Pacific Agreement, which are kind of these regional policies that look at bringing different nations in the Pacific together. Or it could be through the UN Alliance of Small Island States, or AOSIS, which was when multiple countries advocated for limiting global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And they were able to get that language included in the Paris Agreement. And this was done by a coalition of small island states. And that 1.5 degree metric really reflected that some of the most damaging impacts from climate change are going to be felt at that temperature increase in the places that are least responsible for contributing to the problem. In terms of gaps in the region, in terms of collaboration, I think it really reflects the varieties of governance structures throughout the region. So for example, we have the state of Hawaii, which is less included in those kind of UN level, regional Pacific Islands level activities. The North and South Pacific states interact less with each other. Languages separate French Polynesia from the rest of the Pacific, so we don't see them in a lot of meetings doing climate science. And freely associated states and territories have these complex and different relationships with the US, where they have different rights, sovereignty, socioeconomic conditions, and governance systems. So initiatives that really bring all of these different groups of Pacific Islanders together for climate justice are quite rare. So you see, Northern Hemisphere, Southern Hemisphere, or languages and data being parceled out on a national level rather than a shared international space. But these areas where we do have the chance to come together, I think, are very valuable because islands are small in population. So when we band together, we do have a stronger voice in terms of climate justice. We also have gaps in equal access to disaster funding and to climate adaptation funding in the region. So for example, the Green Climate Fund is administered by the UN Environmental Program, and it's targeted at assisting developing countries with climate adaptation, but it's very difficult to access. And I say this from very recent experience, that the accessing the funds and the reporting requirements are extremely time consuming. And it's really hard for the countries that are being targeted here, the developing Pacific Islands, to access it and be able to equitably get access to that data, that research, and those adaptations.
Thank you very much for unpacking some of the challenge, but also helping us understand the opportunities that exist and how we can begin, hopefully, to fill the gaps with our extended community. And I want to turn to you, Kealoha. I guess I've dispensed with your honorifics. I hope that's all right. I'm Auntie Maya, but yeah, Victoria, Kealoha, Dr. Fox, Dr. Keener. But I was thinking about, as Victoria was speaking, this notion of needing to be able to speak in shared concepts, but also the fact that certain regions communities are suffering greatly, and also may have solutions that are useful and stem from intimate connection experience of suffering, vulnerability, in some cases tragedy, but also knowledge of solutions. And I believe that Pacifica and Indigenous communities specifically have a lot of experience from which we can learn moving forward. And as an Indigenous woman leader who connects communities from and in Pacifica, and I wanted to ask you about, what you think the region had and Indigenous communities, what specifically we should be paying attention to in terms of what they are teaching the world when it comes to climate justice. And I'm sorry that was awkwardly asked, but yes, if you can speak a little bit to the valuable knowledge, wisdom, and processes of Indigenous and Pacifica communities, I'd be so grateful.
Of course, Auntie Maya.
Thank you.
It's always Auntie Maya. No, absolutely. I mean, absolutely. I think you're right. And I always approach this conversation with my own, my own positionality is the embodiment of the cultural wisdom from my ancestors and, the places that I'm anchored to in these beloved communities that I get to be a part of. Right. And so when I think of how I ask myself, what is my role in maybe being a teacher or a participant or an actor in some of this work, I simply try to describe it as I'm just here to plant. And what I'm here to plant are native and indigenous and endemic trees. And so in this case, I really feel like in this conversation, I'm here to plant kukui trees. And these kukui trees are medicinal. They have long been a part of our Oihana Mauliola and the ways in which we have an integral connection between our physical health, but also our spiritual well-being. And so I think about that because I know that that's something that's not only generalizable to myself as a Kanaka Maoli, but is a part of wisdom that's been passed down to many of us around the world that identify in these positionalities and are embodied more by a cultural way of knowing and why we're answering our call to justice through these lenses. And so I really wanted to just kind of share a couple of the organizations that I get to be a part of and I get to do this work with, including the Institute for Climate and Peace, that has a really clear overarching goal and framework that Indigenous innovation and culturally responsive solutions should be anchored in the way that we approach not just climate, but also peace. I'm on the National Congress of American Indians Climate Action Task Force, and I do represent the Native Hawaiian seat on the technical committee. And so what we're trying to do at that larger United States level is we're trying to formulate and advocate really good tribal consensus practices, methodologies, participatory democracy that is not putting our own ways of having discussion or coming in and arriving at a solution on the back burner, right? So where we don't have Robert's rules taking over the ways in which our community has always been discussing these issues from time immemorial, right? And so I'm really lucky to be a part of those spaces that still honor the ways in which we process solutions for action and not just the content itself. And then I also did want to share, as a former commissioner to the Hawaii State Climate Commission for mitigation and adaptation, they took really important steps, and I know Dr. Keener is a part of this work for the city and county of Honolulu as well, of what it means to build a better normal. And so they created a post-COVID-19 recovery and outlined principles for a climate-ready Hawaii. So what I mean by sharing all of these examples is you have not just interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary work, but now we have multiple sectors working together. We're at the bedrock and at the very foundation. I'm finally starting to see ways in which Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous communities are still honored and acknowledged. We still have a lot of work to do. That should never be at the expense of our elders and our natural resources, and appropriation is still something that we're always struggling with. That happens a lot in traditional Hawaiian health and medicine, right? So when I approach this work from a ho'oponopono perspective of how I have been trained by my ancestors and by my kumu and haku in ho'oponopono, is definitely not what you will see when you research it or you search it on YouTube. That I can tell you, hands down, is not ho'oponopono. But I bring that up because I also think it has so much to do with our worldview. And going back to what Maxine and Camille were saying, is that this is not an incremental, individualistic problem, right? When we talk about issues like asthma or affordable housing or environmental degradation of our vai, right? These are these strong, systemic issues. But for us as Indigenous communities, we also have a really strong systemic solutions and ways that we're anchored to the possibility, right? And so I always think about it from the lens of our spirituality in our deities. I think about Haumea, I think about Kane, I think about Kanaloa. This is a Piko Owake. We just finished the Piko Owake, and this is the time in which we are transitioning from Ku into Lono. What are the ways in which that lens and that worldview changes your impression of what solution you think is right, and the timing for which you present those solutions, and that alignment and the ways in which we're connected so deeply to our environment guides us to what's possible.
Sorry, I need to unmute myself. That was lovely. I got lost in your words and vision. I believe you are speaking so powerfully to a sense of restorative justice and positive peace building and conflict transformation that Maxine spoke of earlier, in the work that we do together at the Institute for Climate and Peace and at the Matsunaga Institute as well. Maxine, I'd love to turn to you and just ask you to begin answering this question, though others I hope will chime in. But in light of the uncommon nature of this moment and the possibilities that have opened up, and the connection that is happening, and that more nuanced understanding of which you spoke, perhaps there is in fact an opportunity to create the world that we'd all like to see. All of us have participated in work to imagine our beloved communities and to think about actions that might build that beloved community. I'd like you to perhaps speak, Maxine, first to what does that look like to you? What does true climate justice look like? Not just where do we want to go, but how does it feel as well? And then anyone else who wants to answer that question, I'd be grateful.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, I think what we this is a big question, and I think there's been a lot of concern and I think fair criticism about not being a little bit more sort of at the 5-foot level versus the 30,000-foot level about describing the world that we'd like to see. We need textures, we need colors, we need sounds, we need smells. Like, what is it that we're looking for? What are our preferred futures? And let's be specific about how we get there. Now, that's still, though, admittedly a big question, and it's not going to be an easy ride. And just one more Bill McKibben quotation, because again, I was writing the notes on his, when he visited years ago. It was fascinating because he said, someone asked him about what it's like to protest and have to go to jail, right? Because of this, urgent need to make the point. And he said, it's not the end of the world. The end of the world is the end of the world, right? And I thought that was so profound because oftentimes I present this notion that we have to get to this sort of like ground level textured understanding of what we want to see in the future. And yes, it's hard. Yes, I talk about climate reparations, and yes, it sounds like it's an impossibility, but I promise that the alternative is truly impossible, right? We cannot hope for a better future if we continue on the current path. And so, big question, small bite at answering it. Putting my law professor hat back on, there's certain sort of basic elements of decision making that will help us get closer to knowing that we're proceeding more consistently with justice, with what is just. And for climate justice in particular, there are a few that I want to just identify. There are four. The first is distributive justice. And if you do any CRT work, critical race theory, these are concepts that are critically important. Understanding the burdens and the benefits and how they're distributed. I think we've already diagnosed that they're not distributed appropriately at the moment. So whatever kind of decisions that we're making about reducing emissions, about adapting to climate change, about especially introducing controversial approaches that are innovative, that are promising it to be a silver bullet, things like geoengineering, they have to be considered with these justice sort of gates, right? These gates that allow us to ensure that we've checked off important elements of ensuring justice. And so who is going to be burdened by this? Who benefits from this? What does that look like in a climate just future? Procedural justice, who's at the table? We've talked about that now. It's been really hard to get to the table. We don't even like what the table is made of, right? We're not weaving the appropriate spaces. Now, in the future though, are we ensuring that who is at the table reflects those who have the great ideas, the appropriate worldviews, the vastly more important intellectual technology that's needed to answer these questions. Corrective justice, that is a really big part of understanding who has been harmed and have we repaired the relationship, have repaired their state of being and the relationships between those who've harmed them and the harmed. That's critically important because we are asking for a level of coordination and collaboration in order to respond to the climate challenge that is unprecedented. We need right relationships, and corrective justice is seeking to get to the point of right relationships. And then social justice, which is sort of, it seems like the catch-all, but is really underscoring what we've been talking about, which is that all of these things are so intimately intertwined, and we're gonna keep hammering that, we have to understand it. But here's a perfect example. If we actually honored our treaties with Native Americans, would we be fighting over Standing Rock? Would be fighting over a pipeline being run through indigenous communities, threatening water? This is happening all over our country and all over the globe. If we don't pay attention to social justice, we can't solve these problems, right? If we have right relations in all that we do, we have that as a beginning point for knowing that we're on the right path. So those are my contributions as a first bite.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to add anything?
I would just love to add, because I know that the partners have organized this event to recognize International Day of Peace, and I think Constitution Day. And I also just, so for me, because I know I see in the chat, there's a lot of folks affiliated with the university. We have a lot of students here. We have a lot of faculty. We have a lot of professors. And many of us are educated about our history. And many of us are educated about the history of Hawaii and this place that we call home. And so what I would like to add as one specific example is to take us back to 1978 in the Hawaii State Constitution and the creation of the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, and to charge the University of Hawaii's system to ensure that they are being fair to the public land trust in the lands in which this university sits upon. And I think that that's something that we feel really strong about, is if we are going to continue to talk about other places such as Standing Rock and the plethora of other indigenous communities and the ways in which rights are codified into these legally binding documents, that we also need to be talking about the public land trust and the seized lands from the Native Hawaiian people as well.
Thank you so much, Kealoha and Maxine. And you know, my hope is that in being specific about actions that we can support or share to achieve climate justice, that we can also begin answering Naima's question, which is, as people who have the privilege of access to higher education, how can we bridge the gap between those who have this privilege and those who do not? How do you suggest we make the knowledge and education around climate justice and injustice more accessible to those communities that are likely most negatively impacted by climate change, but are often not afforded the opportunity to be present within higher education spaces? So I would love if Victoria, or if Dr. Keener and Dean Nelson might perhaps answer that question. How do we specifically act to support, to share space with, and give opportunity to those who are the least included and have the less access?
It's a fantastic question, and I'm going to approach it from my very narrow, expertise and perspective, but I know that there are a million ways that we can go about doing this, and this is just one of them. And the way that my research group has really taken on this question is by including communities that are being affected in the production of the research. So this would mean, for example, before we even go to a NOAA or a funder to look at doing a scientific grant, we're reaching out to communities where we know there are big climate impacts, or where there's a policy problem, or where people are looking for adaptation funding. And we talk to leaders in the community, or different stakeholders, whether it's water managers or watershed partnerships, or freshwater utilities even. It could be a variety of different partners and sectors, but people outside of the academic community, and bring them in to shape that research plan. And there was recently a study that came out that looked at what was the most important factor in getting scientific data into policy and management plans. And it's kind of depressing if you work in this world, but the factor they found was the most influential in getting data and science into policymaking was the number and intensity of interactions with that group. So just by the simple fact of going out and talking to people, integrating them into the project, creating that relationship and that trust again and again, you are creating a way for science and climate justice to get into that community, just by creating a relationship with them.
I think those insights are absolutely right. And I want to just underscore the collaborative possibilities that are furthered through trust, and recognize that in many instances, many educational institutions, just like other enterprises, have not always done right by the communities in which they are situated, and frankly, had missions that were exclusionary intentionally. So as educators and as institutions of higher education, we have ongoing work to do to make sure that we are respectfully and humbly building those relationships of goodwill, of good faith, because we are all interdependent, right? We are part of something bigger than ourselves, one would hope. So it must be part of what we do. It has to be core to what we do from the outset of these conversations. My hope would be that we are engaging those community members and parts of our larger families who are most directly impacted by what we purport to be studying. And I think sometimes the breakdowns that we experience in lots of different spaces is because we sometimes don't do that. So I would encourage us to, again, sort of using the languages of respect and community building and humility, encourage us to continue to recognize that there is wisdom and knowledge and insight and intellect in so many places that is completely untethered from whether one has degrees on behind one's name. And I think all of us have had experiences where we have met the most brilliant of individuals who are not in these spaces and learned so much from them and must continue to necessarily learn from people in multiple spaces.
Thank you both so much. I want to speak for a moment about joy and the challenge of finding joy at this time and in this work. You have spoken about some of the grim situations and reality, but there is behind each of your words, in my view, a hope and ultimately an optimist's gaze. I would like, if you could, each of you speak to the possibility of joy in this work, and also courage. Do we have the courage to do this work? What might make us more courageous? What gives you courage? What would an act of courage look like in your position of access, in your activism, and in your engagement? So if you could each speak to joy and courage, I'd be grateful.
Can I jump in and tell me if this resonates? So these moments are moments of sharing, but they're also, at least for me, moments of refueling and nourishment. And I just want to thank you all for that, because I think to assume that our positionality in these spaces is costless to our souls at this time, or that we come into this work unaffected or not wounded from what is going on in our world, is to be incredibly, I think, unrealistic. So I think many of us, and I'll just speak honestly, are struggling with this particular time, right? And everything that is going on. So I want to thank you all for your brilliance. And it's always nice to see so many young experts and brilliant women in the same space. And I want to uplift that and celebrate that. I think part of what we do is reaffirm each other's humanity in a world that sometimes is incredibly dismissive of our, not just our existence, but our humanity. And so the support that is this collective and this community of caring cannot be underestimated. It brings me joy to see the next generation of leaders engaging in these conversations. I take great joy from seeing our, and hearing and learning from our students. I think this moment requires a great deal of courage. And if I sort of reflect on, for example, the life of Justice Ginsburg, I think, we think about how one can imagine a role for ourselves in spaces where we don't exist or didn't exist. And I think about how she must have sort of like thought about what's possible, even if she didn't see people like her necessarily in those places of possibility. And that's a courageous act. It's also a courageous act, and I'll end with this, to take care of yourself. And I want to, I mentioned despair, and I mentioned nourishment, and I mentioned refueling, and I just want to encourage us all to be intentional also in centering our own well-being in the midst of challenge, because without that, it is impossible to continue to do the work that is called justice seeking work. So do not think of it as selfish. Think of it as a necessity to prepare you and prolong your possibilities for transformational justice seeking.
I'm happy to chime in here, and also echo that self-care is an act of rebellion as well, right? Especially this is the important reminder that we have. I would say that, you know, especially because we've had to really investigate what joy means in this last few months, that we know that community and fellowship are absolutely so critically important. And we literally cannot live well without that. We can't live in healthy ways without that. So I think as I think about the climate crisis, but also the expanded network of people that are engaging in it, I'm joyful. I see a fellowship and connection and community that's really quite wonderful. I also want to underscore again that there's there's so many things that have indicated the world as it could be, right? And this is really important to answer even the earlier question about, like, what does this look like on the ground? What does that actually look like? And just to, you know, sort of a plug for things as policy wonky as the Green New Deal, which still needs to be teased out, which is far from controversial. In fact, what we're doing now is the controversy. What we're hoping to do with the Green New Deal is a beautiful, I think, again, holistic and comprehensive approach to wellness and environment broadly defined. We have regenerative agriculture, we have distributed energy. There are so many beautiful ideas that are out there. And again, we just need to have different people at the table. This is why terms like Anthropocene drive me kind of crazy, because the Anthropocene suggests that, yes, we are, as a human society, impacting at this moment in time in our geology, but this wouldn't have been inevitable if every human being was at the helm, right? We sort of suggest that by that there weren't other ideas, there weren't other rich ways of living, and there weren't other attempts at actually actualizing that, while still acknowledging that we can have a global impact. In terms of courage, I just want to say, especially because we've been talking so much about young people and two young people and inviting conversation, I don't feel all that courageous a lot of the time, right? It's scary. And I just want to acknowledge that sometimes the courage is really coming from a place of thinking, oh my God, you know, this is my future, this is my children's future. I just want to sort of bust the notion that, for the reasons that Dean Nelson was sharing, we need that self-care because we are working we're working in surge mode. So what I've heard some people say, for some of us for our entire lives. And right now we are time pressed, we're time bound, and having courage sometimes just feels like survival, right? And so I just want to sort of deconstruct this notion of it as valiant, even though it may present that way. Sometimes I say things just because I can't stand it not being said, right? But at the same time, I also feel like I draw a lot of courage from my ancestors. And you know, I've had ancestors for generations who were born and died enslaved, right? And how did they survive? And I actually want to honor that this is a way of understanding that courage takes different forms, is sometimes silent and quiet, and it's just about raising your children, seeing a vision, committing to the future, committing to your lives, committing to the peoples around you. And so I take a lot of strength from knowing that I'm descended from survivors. I'm also Jamaican, and that story is one that fuels me pretty significantly.
I would love to follow up with my two Jamaican sisters and colleagues here. And though I think what we're talking about is ambitious, I think it's totally possible. And I think I love that we're talking about self-care. Like I never get to be on panels that we're talking about self-care. We're so usually talking about the technical issues and what are the technical solutions. And at the end of the day, as your sister, as your friend, I'm also just like, but I want you to be well. And I want your family to be well. And I want us to think much more about community health and the ways in which we love our work, and that work is an extension of community health. And for me, I think I try to just have courage every day. In my field, in my sector, I work every day to decolonize healthcare, which is it's a very complex system. It is about individual health, it's about capitalism, and it's about a system that has been perpetuated on the backs of people who have been sick for many generations, like those systemic issues that we've talked about before. But I also see that earthquake and that possibility. So I want to share. So I just did a survey of our health plan, which is the only locally founded health plan in Hawaii that does not have corporate interests in the continental US. We just did a survey, and we're talking about the ways in which we need to expand our programs and services and what are covered benefits. And so I just want to share two domains that came up. One, these are clinicians. These are physicians, these are social workers, these are pharmacists, these are health IT techs. They want to see more investment in our food and natural environment, and they want to see a greater community and cultural strengthening. And if that's possible in healthcare and in a managed care organization, I fundamentally believe that it is entirely possible in many other spaces as well. And I just wanted to share a demonstration of where I find joy, and I find a little bit of outlet every day, and it's in my son's artwork. He's been drawing throughout this pandemic, and he drew this image yesterday for Kumu, this is the other day, sorry, for Kumu Kalenu'uhiwa's birthday. And there has to be ways in which we continue to express our joy. And I just want to thank Auntie Maya for encouraging us to even include this topic in a webinar around climate justice and in racial inequity and social progress and change.
I love that we're all on the same page here. I wrote down as one of my notes, acts of courage in this environment can be as simple as taking care of your family and yourself. So we're all on the same page. You know, going back to kind of the darker moment that we're in right now for a minute, there have been a lot of times this year where I felt, you know, hopeless and despair at what's going on and unable to make a difference, you know, despite all these things that we're trying to do. But what brings me back and centers me every time is hearing about the bravery of other people, other women, and watching how they have never given up and have continued to speak truth to power in so many different areas of life, not just climate, but all sorts of different sectors. You know, people like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, people like Greta Thunberg, the communities in Louisville that have protested for justice for Breonna Taylor for over 120 days now. So, you know, these are things that bring us back. And I'm just going to end with, I wanted to bring attention to a specific document that lays out some specific policy areas for Hawaii in particular, that brings together kind of these themes of climate equity and regrowth during and post this COVID time. And that's the Blue Planet Waypoints document. This was released maybe a month or two ago. Time is messy now, I don't remember. But I'll put the link in the chat box, but it has 7 specific themes with a whole bunch of different policy actions that we can really do at the state level and county level to increase our resilience, create green jobs, rebuild the economy, and create a more equitable society.
Thank you so much. And I want to point out that there are some other links that have been placed in the chat box. In fact, Kealoha just recently put the National Congress for American Indians Climate Action Task Force. And there are others. If you want to scroll back, by all means, copy and paste these links and explore them more fully. I want to turn now to a question that was posed online. We do have, I see from the chat, we have folks from Seattle, from Detroit, from Japan, from Indonesia, where I was born. And I want to acknowledge, and I so enjoyed the presence of people who come from many lands across many waters. I do have a question here, though, from the East-West Center Leadership Program that is about Hawaii. But of course, we can learn from Hawaii, and the lessons can be applied, scaffolded, or utilized in part, at least in other places. The question reads more or less as follows. Our major industries are tourism and militarism, which are extractive and resource intensive, yet they have also provided livelihood for local or transient populations. Tourism has been impacted by COVID, so people in those industries are experiencing the fragility of that industry. The military has not lost investment and increased its initiative, which are often about land grabbing, military tension, war preparation. These are the structural, political, economic, working class realities that create unevenness in who feels they can be a stakeholder, participate in climate justice work. What are ways to unite communities in Hawaii through workers, indigenous communities, immigrants, locals, newcomers, Hawaii-based U.S. international as well as international contacts, in order to create industry change that would be more in alignment with climate justice and resilience? That was a big question. Just to simplify it, can we ask you to speak on ways to unite the various communities and stakeholders in Hawaii towards creating industry change in alignment with climate justice?
That's a very big question.
It is maybe, I mean, maybe some of you, I know that to some degree, the Aloha Economic Futures, many of the proposals that have been submitted, and the various collaboratives of women looking at leadership and negotiating new economic futures and the work on circular economies and so forth. Those things are all factored into some of the efforts that we've seen, perhaps. And I know some of the people on the panel are participating in that. So perhaps you could simply speak to things that you've seen that perhaps might help us think about Hawaii industry and economy differently.
I'll just make a quick comment about the concept of tourism and the future in not just Hawaii, but around the Pacific Islands. And there has been this giant decrease in tourism, and we're seeing a lot of communities suffer as a result from that lack of income. Something that's been coming up more and more is this idea of regenerative tourism. So the idea that how can we create a new system that regenerates the natural resources or communities, for example, that are being visited in these tourism industries. So, for example, if we look at the Republic of Palau in the West Pacific, they have a very ecologically friendly a way of doing tourism. You have to sign a pledge before you land in the country, kind of acknowledging your role when you're visiting and keeping the environment clean, and creating systems that really that heal the ecosystems and the natural resources while getting the economic benefit to communities that live there.
I think that's a great example, and I saw Ambassador Ellis had joined our meeting, and she and I have both been able to spend time in Iceland, and they have a similar environmental pledge when you enter into Iceland as well. And I just want to underscore from Maxine's point, a country that also has an incredible history of a democracy led by women. And so maybe that helps me bridge to some of the work that I've been doing with the Hawaii State Commission on the Status of Women. I did put the Feminist Economic Recovery Plan in the chat. And we know way too well with the work that we're doing with the commission, the ways in which these industries have boomed and then collapsed over Hawaii's history. And that's part of my research, and that's part of the work that I've done for a number of years, right? You can go back And you can look at whaling, you can look at sandalwood, you can look at industrial monocropping of ag around sugar and pineapple, the fields that are literally my backyard now, which are brown fields. And we don't drink the tap water here. And so I talk about that because I think intimately, if you are Native Hawaiian, if you're Pacific Islander, if you're Filipino, you definitely know that the tourism industry has been built in Hawaii across the backs of our people, and that those are low wage, low benefit jobs. And that's part of the reason why we're seeing these fractured and fragile industries collapse. And I personally would love to know more if there's ways in which other countries like Jamaica and Maxine and Camille's knowledge are looking at this through a solutions-focused lens. For me, I think in our work with the Feminist Economic Recovery Plan, what we're talking about is looking at more systems-based long-term solutions. We're looking at universal basic income. We're looking at universal health coverage. We're looking at, you know, paying women. And unpaid care and unpaid work right now is a huge part of COVID-19 and a part of that underbelly of the collapse of these systems that I do think have a lot that are ingrained in tourism and the military exchanges of our economy. But I bring up the history again because it's not that we don't know how these bubbles burst economically and what the social fallout looks like. I think what's really exciting about the Aloha, the Aina Aloha Economic Futures and the Hawaii economic feminist recovery plan and the Blue Planet document, and there's several others that are being mentioned, is we're not looking at incremental change anymore. We're looking at systems change, and we're looking at change that's not just to get us into 2021 and these massive budget reductions, but we're talking about what does the next decade look like? What does the next generation look like? Maybe even what does the next century look like? And so I really encourage folks to look into those documents, look into those groups. We're doing some pretty amazing, fantastic stuff, and we're volunteering. This is not a part of, this is a part of the joy in the work, and it's also a part of the courage to lead, is to be a part of a movement, not just a moment. And I think that exactly the solutions and the samples that are shared here today, and I'll put a couple more in the links, are what should be ingrained in all of these webinars and discussions.
Thank you so very much. This next question comes from KTUH Honolulu and Ari Eisenstadt. The question is, world leaders are gathered now in every corner of the world for the 75th UNGA, the UN General Assembly. If you were given the mic, what message would you leave with them today?
I guess I'll share again. So I was given the mic a couple of days ago, and I was part of the 75th convening. And I did have the honor to moderate a session with Women in Global Health, Foreign Policy Magazine, and the Wagner Foundation. There's a couple of things. One, vote up and down the entire ballot. Two, hire women, promote women, pay women. Support, resource, respect Indigenous, First Nations, communities and their NGOs. And also, before I pass the mic to somebody else for UNGA, is to be the legacy that your destiny is asking you to be right now.
Thank you so much, Mahalo. Does anyone else want to step in on that one?
I'll just say that, you know, I think we want our leaders to lead like all of our lives depended on it, and have that sense of commitment and urgency to it, and see themselves as absolutely and necessarily climate leaders, right? There's no such thing as leadership or effective leadership, I think, today moving forward that does not include that acknowledgement of the fact that the leadership decisions they make are absolutely climate decisions. I also just want to say, for my space of sort of working on some of the international law issues and the dynamics that are present there, we have a tendency in that international space to really think about regulating, at least in international environmental law, the waste, a lot of the actions that are happening in the so-called global South, and we do a lot less in terms of addressing the overconsumption of the North. And so shifting our focus on what we're doing and emphasizing the doing of less harm is as important as it is to, sort of to build up an infrastructure to respond to climate change. We can't sort of give in this one space with one hand and then sort of slap, kick, and stomp with the rest, right? And I actually asked that of not only just our international leaders, but our private sector leaders, our philanthropy, the folks that are working in philanthropy. What does it mean to actually deal with our activities that are producing the harm, auditing our laws for what greases the wheels there? How does that reflect a new kind of understanding of leadership that's not about building or creating more, but is about stopping the harm that we're doing now? That reflection, I think, if it happens at the international level, could be really quite powerful.
Thank you so much. We only have time for one more question, so I'm going to collapse 3 questions into one, so as to address, because that's fun, in order to address everyone at least a little bit. The question is this: can we have a climate teach-in at our university? This person kind of thinks of climate events as this century's version of the last century's rise of industrialization, and the need to communicate about survival, given the urgency of this time, requires also perhaps specific communication techniques that you might prefer when discussing scientific topics with non-scientists, and including people who see themselves outside of the climate or environmental space. So the question, I guess, is how do we bring people in and organize events and movement building and bridge gaps between local, international, between larger islands, smaller islands, and between people who see themselves as climate people and people who see themselves as well outside. So really the idea is, how do we bring people in who see themselves as peripheral or outside of this conversation?
Well, as someone who has, some of my closest friends don't see themselves as climate people, and the conversations that I try to have is really, again, collapsing this down and into its component parts and how we got here, right? This isn't a scientific issue, right? So science can help us understand a lot about how sort of the specifics of atmospheric chemistry, projections about what the future will be. It's critically important, but how we got to that point is about our relationships with one another, issues of power and access and hierarchy. And a lot of the people, most people know what that looks like, right? At a personal level, interpersonal level, at a community, at a sort of larger social justice movement sort of level. And if we understand that this is a breakdown in these fundamental ways of thinking about each other, the ethics of the situation, the fairness of the situation, it's very accessible. I think, and can be a very, very much a galvanizing force. And again, also focusing on the world that we'd like to see, that vision, and being very clear about it is going to be, I think, a much more engaging way of us sort of working together on the preferred climate futures that we'd like to see.
It also, in terms of the teach-in potential, as we see a number of schools collaborate around anti-racism teach-ins, it opens up, I think, what you were speaking about earlier as well, Maxine, and a number of us on the panel, the interdisciplinarity and the internationality and the multidimensionality and the generational necessity of these conversations, the intergenerational necessity. So I think it expands the possibilities if we think about it more holistically. And the interesting thing with the possibilities of the methodologies through which we are all communicating now, whether it's Zoom or WebEx or whatever, is it does allow for greater access in some ways, right? You know, not everybody can physically be here and can't in lots of ways because of the pandemic, but I want to urge us to also explore the potential collaborative possibilities that are enhanced through these technologies to further these conversations towards better outcomes.
Thank you so much. I would like to ask attendees to perhaps in chat now note one word or sentence, one takeaway from today, or one thing to which you will commit as a result of today's conversation. I want to give thanks to the law school at UH Manoa and the Matsunaga Institute for Peace and Conflict Resolution, as well as to the various co-sponsors and community partners aforementioned. I am profoundly grateful for this discussion and all of you and your work in the world together. I believe that you have helped us today recognize and remember, reinforce, sensitize. I believe we are better equipped as a result of this conversation to do the work of climate justice, to build those relationships of goodwill, of genuine faith, to challenge ethnic, racial, gender, and youth exclusion as we are doing this work. My hope is that all in attendance do not forget the social, cultural, community dimensions of justice, and in engaging in collaborative problem solving and recovery, that you also see yourselves as peace builders and climate justice workers. So we are profoundly hopeful and made more courageous by your collective presence. Looking at the chat, I do see do less harm, persistence, courage, amplification, possibility, and solidarity as words that have been shared, and I hope amplified and continued courage will emerge after today. Thank you very much. It's 4:59. I'd like to close and bid you all much aloha.